Well, China's rise on the global stage, of course, has been talked about for a while now as it gets closer to becoming the world's biggest economy. But a prominent thinker on the rise of Asia says there's much more to the region than just China. Parag Khanna is a former advisor to the US military. He's considered something of a foreign policy whiz kid, and he joins us now from Singapore. He has written a book called The Future is Asian, and it's a delight to welcome him to the world. Thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Now, China, of course, has dwarfed the conversation regionally. Why do you think we have to change our thinking on this?
It is true. You know, for the past 15 years, we've been all consumed with China, China, China. It's sort of like one of those Trump audio tapes you can see on YouTube where he just talks about China all the time. And in fact, the whole world has been like that. The truth is that, to put things in context, China is only 1/3 of Asia's population, right? There are 4.5 billion people in Asia, and China is only 1/3 of them. China is only half the GDP of the region. China is less than half of the inbound investment into the region. You've got India now growing faster than China. You have ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, attracting more foreign investment than China. So we do have to appreciate that, yes, China's rise has been critical to the collective rise of Asia, but it's not the sum of all the parts. So we really do need to think beyond China.
And also you've pointed out that, in fact, China's rise was also thanks to the largesse and commitment of other countries in the region like Singapore. So this is far more intricately linked than we necessarily think.
Absolutely right. You know, starting with the post-World War II era, it was Japan, of course, that really began and kicked off and still, to a large degree, sustains the Asian economic miracle. And Japan's modernization and industrialization inspired the tiger economies of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. And then came China 40 years ago. But the biggest investors in the Chinese story were Japan and the tigers and Singapore. And now you have the fourth wave of Asian growth that has already taken off. South Asia, Southeast Asia, the countries from Pakistan through India, all the way through Indonesia and the Philippines. That is 2.5 billion people in this next Asian growth wave. Many of those economies are growing faster than China. Every single one of them has a younger population than China by median age. And they're not competing. China has become one of the largest investors in all of those countries as well. So we have had 4 waves of mutually reinforcing growth over the past 75 years, and it has not relented. It's actually going to continue to grow even faster. So my view is that even as China slows down, the rest of Asia is really getting started.
So then we do have the perception, though, that China is controlling the knobs and the dials. They're lending money with great largesse and funding projects. And there is this great concern that there will be a payday. Do you see that happening?
It really depends on the country. There is no doubt that small and very weak countries like Laos or Cambodia are caught in a certain degree to a debt trap with China. By the way, that debt trap really does predate the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's be absolutely clear. Small, weak, vulnerable, landlocked countries that don't have access to capital markets are always dependent on one patron, whether it's America or Germany or Britain or China for that matter. So China is not necessarily to be blamed. But the fate of Belt and Road, the fate of Asia, does not hinge on Cambodia or Laos, right? If you look at countries that really matter, like Pakistan or Malaysia or Kazakhstan, these countries are actually being very, very mindful of their debt levels to China. They're reducing their dependence on China for investment. They're trying to attract more investment from the rest of the world so that they can actually dilute China's influence. So again, Chinese infrastructure investment is actually a good thing. I want to be absolutely categorically clear about this. There is no case where you can say that a country grew and that its economy had sustained 10, 15 years of growth where you didn't have the basic infrastructures for populations of 100 or 200 or 300 million people. So the infrastructure is very important, but it has to be done more sustainably. And there's a lot of competitors now in that infrastructure finance marketplace, not just China. So we shouldn't draw a straight line from China lends to country X to that country falls like a domino to China. That's not really the way things are playing out. Countries are being a lot more shrewd than we give them credit for.
That's interesting. What degree of autonomy, though, will China give other countries, say like India, which they are also funding in a substantial way?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, it's not really about what China gives to those countries. It's what those countries are taking. Just under 2 years ago, we had a very significant military standoff between India and China at the so-called Doklam Plateau, where the two countries border and meet with Bhutan. And there, what we saw after a lot of nationalist, patriotic chest thumping was that China backed down. The more powerful country backed down. Why? The reason is that even though they could defeat India, they have to think about 13 other borders and all of these countries where they have all these investments and projects. And if they humiliate India, if they defeat India, what's the backlash going to be everywhere else? So let's remember that China, even if it has grand ambitions, can be tamed, can be not contained, but can certainly be shaped in a direction that is still mutually beneficial.
Tell me what you make of the trade war, though, between the United States and that friction that is developing between, of course, the world's superpower and a power that has been allowed to grow and move and invest and sort of not be judged in the same way.
Well, let's be clear. China is already a superpower in many ways. You don't have to have an aircraft carrier parked off the coast of Argentina to be considered a superpower, right? China is the world's largest economy, the world's most populous country, a major industrial, technological, financial hub of the world. So it already is a superpower. However, when you think about the trade war in particular, a trade war has more than two players. And the winner of this trade war is undeniably ASEAN. Southeast Asia wins the trade war between the US and China, because so much more outsourcing and diversion of investment is now going to ASEAN that it was not going into China. So it's accelerating trends that were already underway. But that also is a reminder that Asia as a whole wins from the trade war, because what's happening is the acceleration of this mutually reinforcing sort of set of complementarities that Asian economies have with each other. So what I see is the trade war really benefiting this Asian integration. For example, Korean, Japanese companies that make semiconductors are now going to displace the American ones that have been hit by reciprocal tariffs from the Chinese market, right? Europe is also a winner. Look at the major deal that Airbus signed with China during Xi Jinping's visit to France last week. That is not a coincidence. That is not an accident. China decided to tip the scales in Airbus's favor against Boeing as a result of this trade war. So the trade war is having a much more negative impact on the United States than the administration would lead us to believe. And it's benefiting China's more significant trading partners, which are Europe and other Asian countries and neighbors.
So many people praise Trump. I mean, they criticize him for many things, but they praise Trump for trying to unsettle the world order that has allowed the growth of China. Are his tactics going to pay off for the United States?
No, as I just said, quite the opposite. You can't, on the one hand, have a sort of one-sided trade war with China without taking into account the reciprocal tariffs, without taking into account the fact that even your allies like Europe and Japan are actually trying to undercut you and compete with you commercially, and then not to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which of course the US did not join, which really cedes commercial advantage to Australia, to Japan, to Canada, and to other allies that will do more business in Asia now. So much of Trump's Asia policy, including his China policy, is quite misguided. And I think we're seeing the evidence of that every single day.
Parag, really interesting to get your perspective on these issues. Thank you.
My pleasure.